Again, hi, welcome. This is Professor Hosmer. This is the Saturday Python tutoring session, and welcome and thanks for stopping in. I did get one question that I wanted to answer first, but before I do that, just want to make sure that you guys can see my screen okay and hear me. Just want to make sure.
All good.
Great, thanks, Scott. I appreciate it. Let me bring up my the chat window too, just in case somebody wants to chat. Sorry, we're getting all kinds of weather alerts. We had storms and potential tornadoes coming through here, but it looks like it's gone. So we'll be able to pull off the tutoring session. So anyway, I got one question, and it was a really good question. And in the starter script that I provided you with, I created several classes. Each one has a lookup that allows you to look up various items, and some of those were used. The question I got was regarding the ports lookup. So again, the ports lookup loads in that Pickle file and then allows you to, when you do a lookup, you provide the port number and you provide the port type. And the question was, well, wait a minute, what am I passing into this particular function, the lookup, once I've created the object? So remember, down here in the actual code, we create all of the objects right off the bat, which basically does the initialization. In other words, it brings in those Pickle files and creates the dictionary that we're going to use to look up. So what I did was just kind of show you how this works. I just added a print statement here. I can rerun this again. And the way this works is if I call the lookup function, which is part of the port object that we created in these instructions here, I can pass in a port number, and I can basically pass in the port type, which is basically the protocol. In other words, if it was TCP or UDP, because even though there's port numbers are consistent for the most part across TCP and UDP, those are the two protocols that you are able to get a translation of the port number into a name. All right. Sometimes they are different. So the function that you're calling here is going to look up a port number, which is a string, and it's going to look up the port number based on TCP. I'm going to show you one other thing in a second. So when I'm here and I hit the F6 key, obviously it prints out telnet. So the lookup said, okay, port 23 for TCP is in fact telnet. So all we're doing is looking up and translating the port number into a port name, just so that we have that information. But before I go beyond this, let me go back and show you a little trick that was included in the original script. I didn't make any modifications here. A lot of times within my scripts, I will check to see if debug is on, and right now it's false. But if it was true, after we've basically processed the Pickle file during the init, it'll print out each of the key value pairs. So whenever you're kind of trying to wonder what the key value pairs are, you can use this kind of construct in order to fill it out. So what I would do in this particular case, at the top, there's a constant or pseudo constant in Python called debug. If I set that constant to true, I don't know why I had two of them. If I set that constant to true, and then come down and set my breakpoint here, when I get to this, we'll rerun the script now. Let's save it, because I changed that to true. So now in this particular case, debug is now true, right? And you can use this trick anywhere in your code where you want to print out some sort of debug information, and then you can turn it off, when you're not using it. So in this case, debug is true, right? So I'm going to say, for key value, and just we've done this a million times before, I want to basically iterate through all of the port dictionary items, and I'm going to basically print them out. So now it's going to basically print out all of the port dictionary. Now you could have done that. You could use this kind of approach in any of the lookups. The other lookups don't have this little section of code, but you could put it in. So in this particular case, let's say we went back to transport. If we wanted to do that here, you could add this code here for the transport dictionary and actually print out those values as well. So if I took the code that was here, for example, and I came back to, I don't know if transport's a good one to look up. Let's do the MAC address. And I wanted to see, well, what is in the MAC address? I could say if debug is true. So in this case, instead of port dictionary, it's going to be MAC dictionary. So we could basically say MAC dictionary, right? And I'll set a breakpoint here now so that we can actually step through this. So whenever you're curious about this, so in this case, we loaded in the OUI, which is the organizational unit identifier that is available to let us know what each MAC address relates to. There's quite a bit of information in here. So now I can get the key value pair. And when I look at the key, right, it's basically the MAC address, right? It's actually the first three bytes of the MAC address basically gives us the manufacturer. But there's a lot of information in the value portion of the MAC address lookup. For example, there's GB, and then there's the Diamond Sales Limited is the name of the. This is the country code, Great Britain, and then this is the actual OUI, and there's a bunch of other stuff. Like here's the address of that particular Diamond Sales Limited is 17 Charterhouse Street. So you can step through each one of these, and now you kind of see what the key is, right? So when you're passing a key into the lookup function, that's all you have to do, which is the MAC address, which is going to be the first 3 octets of the MAC address, which basically represents the manufacturer. So you can make those kinds of modifications to the starter script in order to do that. And if you use the technique with if debug, then when you don't want to see that anymore, you can come back and set debug back to false. And now when we run the script, it'll come down to that. I've got a breakpoint set here at this debug, but now this time, obviously, it won't do it because we have that set. And I can still print out the one attempt that I had here, but I could also surround this with if debug and say, hey, I just want to print out this one to make sure everything worked okay or whatever. I can go back and restart this. Just kind of quick ways to play around with the script, but you notice in this case it did not print out the lookup for Telnet because the debug is set to false now. So that was one really good question that came up with that basically not only how do I do this for port lookup, but also how do I figure out what is in the dictionary, what is the key and the value that I'm looking up, so then you can actually go back and look at the lookup capabilities. Let's take a look at the port lookup. So the port lookup capability here requires 2 values, right? In order to look up, because when we looked at the key value pair that was there, the key had 2 elements associated with it, the port and the port type. And so we have to put those in order to be able to do that lookup and say, hey, I want to look up the port and port type that was passed in, right? I can do that. And I have to put it into a tuple, because when I'm doing a lookup in a dictionary, the keys of a dictionary can't be a list. They actually have to be a hashable value, which in this case, a tuple is. Typically, we see these lookups when we're doing lookups into a dictionary. There's one item. So that's fine. That'll work no matter what the item is, whether it's a string or an integer or whatever. But in the case when we have multiple items that make up the key, we have to put them into a tuple in order to be able to do that, because the lookup has to be a hashable value, and lists, for example, are not hashable, but tuples are. So that was the one question that I got before the tutoring session today. So hopefully that clears that up, of how to actually approach that when you're actually trying to do the lookup. And again, the starter script basically automatically creates those lookups for you, so then you can just use them. Any questions about that or anything else, now that I've answered the one question, hopefully sufficiently answered the one question about how I use the port lookup?
Yeah, no, that was great. And I tried to put in for the port type protocol, but I guess I'm doing something wrong. Just protocol should give me either it's a TCP or UDP. I'm not sure why.
Well, yeah, that's true. So what did I do in the, I think I just did a simple example here within the starter script. But yeah, so the field that you're looking for, just take a look at that variable before you call the port lookup, and make sure that, remember, the port needs to be a string, not a number. And so does.
Okay.
So that might have been the answer. That might have been the issue that you were running into. If you're trying to pass in a number for the port number, it had to be a string. And that was just because of the way that the dictionary was created initially. So that Pickle file has, as we saw when we did the, and again, that's what the this will do for you. If I turn that off again, turn that back to true, and say start again. So when I look at the debug here, it's true. And if I look at the first one, notice that the first item in that dictionary is a string. So just make sure that when you're trying to pass in the values to the lookup, they look like this. It's a, you're going to pass in two values, the port number, which is a string, and TCP or UDP, which is a string as well. And it should be capitalized too. So it has to be an exact match. So just, that's always a good way to kind of look at what the key value pairs are. So you know, hey, this is the key, it's got to be that. But in your case, the only thing, you don't have to pass in the tuple because you're passing in the two individual ones, and we take care of it here. But the port number has to be a string, and the port type needs to be a string, and it needs to be capitalized. So it's probably just something simple like that that was causing your issue, I'm guessing.
Yep, that actually seems, it's funny how that always works like that.
Well, that's okay. It was a really good question, and I'm glad you asked it, because it's something I'm sure other students are wondering about as well. More importantly, not only how to solve the immediate problem, but also how do I determine what the key value pair looks like? And you can also always iterate through, or you could just, pick one value like I did here and print that out so you can do that. But if I just say go now, it's going to print out all of the key value pairs for the port lookup, so you can see what they all look like. And one of the reasons that you might look at these and say, geez, why are these not in order? Well, they're not in order because it's a dictionary, right? Dictionaries are hashed, so they store them in a order that speeds the lookup by hashing the values that are the key versus putting them in some sort of order. You can do this. Now you can create ordered dictionaries, but then they're not as fast because the lookups don't work off a hash value. They work off of the actual values that are there. So the lookup takes a lot longer. So anyway, that's why we tend to do that. But like I said, good question, because I'm sure that other students were wondering not only how to solve the problem, but how do I actually ever determine this out there when I'm looking at other people's code? How do I determine what that lookup would require, right? As far as the values you're going to pass in.
You need that truth value before to kind of set everything off. Essentially, that's what you need for that type of stuff.
Yeah. So in this case, you could just do it automatically, but typically I just use the I use the value, the debug value as a constant that I can change so that I only execute this when I want to, right? So if I'm trying to figure something out, then I would do that. But otherwise, if I set, the debug to false, right? And let me run this again. If I set it back to false, when I get to this, turn off the debug because it's not going to go there. It basically just ignores all that code. So it just doesn't print that stuff out anymore. So it's a nice way to set up that when you have portions of your code that you want to print things out while you're debugging your script. And once you debug your script, just say debug is false, and then it won't execute any of the code that is indented under the if. And that way, if somebody else comes along or you come along in the future and want to debug something, all you got to do is just change that one value. And then sometimes you could pass that in when you run the script, right? So you could use that could be a variable that gets passed into the script to say, okay, the first value is either true or false for debug. And that way, you could make it an option, an argument option for the script itself. So a couple different ways to do that.
And without knowing, and without actually printing out that dictionary, it could have been a number, I'm assuming, or it could have been a string. It's just, you'd have to try that out and see what works, I guess. Yeah.
That's correct. Yeah, that's what you'd have to do. Now, you bring up a good point, and I'll probably change the add some comments here for the lookups to basically explicitly tell everybody what is expected. That's how you can figure it out when it isn't documented well. And so yeah, that's how you would find out, unless the creator of the lookup provided some documentation.
Thank you. That makes sense now.
Okay, cool. Elizabeth, I noticed that you're here. Anything come across your desk that I should address for this or any of the other questions that you might have?
Yeah, so there was the first question, which was getting the port type, but you already excuse me, covered that. The second question I got was how to build the pretty tables. So this student, they were trying to add the table.add row in every if statement, but when they go to print out the pretty table, they only have one entry in the table.
Yep. And typically that happens because they have the indentation is incorrect, right? So they've reinitialized the pretty table inside the loop. And so let me go to my solution. So for example, let me see where I did the pretty table here. So when you're processing your dictionary, you typically want to create a table, your dictionary table, whatever it's going to be. And that initialization of the table needs to take place outside the loop that you're filling in the values, right? So that you can, append those rows. But if you were to, this is where the add row actually takes place. But if the table creation is inside the loop that you're processing any one of these, then every time through the loop, it's going to reinitialize the table, and you're going to end up with a single entry in your table at the end, because you're adding a row, then you're reinitializing the table, then you're adding a row and reinitializing a table, adding a row and reinitializing a table. So then the table only has one entry in it. That's the most common error that I see, is making sure that your initialization of your table is outside of the loop that you're filling it in. In other words, where you're adding rows. So another good question. It's just that, you got to be careful where you initialize that table. And I'm guessing if you see the student's script, you'll see that the initialization of the table is somehow inside the loop that they're adding rows to the table.
Okay, perfect. I will ask them to send over their script, and I'll take a look.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah, that's the typical problem with pretty tables, is it seems like, hey, I need to initialize the pretty table, but I only need to do that once. I do it every time through the loop, then I'm going to, especially when you're seeing, whenever you're seeing, hey, I only have one entry in my pretty table, but I've been adding all these entries. It's typically because it's just the initialization of the table object is in the wrong place. Cool. Okay, doesn't look like anybody else has jumped in, so I think it'll be a short one, but a good one. A couple of really good questions, and I'll post the recording back so folks can take a look at that and make sure that they have the understand how to actually, go in and, look up those values and figure out, what are the key and values that are associated with any dictionary. So really good question, Scott and Elizabeth. Good question about the pretty table. So since there's nobody else here, I guess I will go ahead, unless there's any final questions anybody has. I will go ahead and end the session and then post the video. Any final thoughts? Any questions? No? Okay, well, good. Have a great rest of your weekend. And if you have more questions or whatever, just shoot a message to me or to Elizabeth, and we'll do our best to give you some suggestions. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.